My not seen.
Oh.
Oh.
Okay.
We've just realized that you might not have been able to hear us, and we've just been moving our mouths, and we're so sorry.
It would not be a virtual event without a huge technical flaw. We really appreciate your patience, and thank you for watching Sarah and Joanna's rehearsal. And now they're going to say everything they just said, but a lot better and more intelligent because they had time to practice.
Although so much more efficient.
It was incredibly intelligent the first time. Just it's going to be more theatrical this time. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's
Round
start
two.
again.
All
Hi,
right,
everyone.
let's start over.
Congratulations to Joanna for this fabulous book called Hotbed. And I'm Sarah Gordon, and I know Joanna from our years working together at the New York Historical Society, where we put together an exhibition called Hotbed, which was Joanna's idea, all about the women and their allies in Greenwich Village of the 19-teens connected to the New York suffrage movement. And now Joanna has expanded so many of these ideas into this marvelous book. So, and you focused much more on heterodoxy. Can you tell everyone what heterodoxy was?
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the Astoria Bookshop for hosting us. I'm so excited to be here with Sarah Gordon, who was very much my co-conspirator in the exhibition that we put together, also about the village, as she said. And really, this book grew out of an unfinished curiosity that heterodoxy was a club that was that operated in the village from 1912 for about 25 years. It's somewhat shrouded in uncertainty historically because the group was devoted to the idea that its members could disagree and argue and have different opinions. Heterodoxy as a name meant different opinions, and what the women wanted to be able to do was to have that freedom and not to feel that they were on record as holding opinions that they couldn't then change. I think that the sense of the sense of kind of that it was difficult to speak freely if your words were being recorded, especially for women who were very prominent. Most of these women were well known as journalists, as political activists, as artists, as writers, and so they had a sense of responsibility. And so they wanted a space that felt like a safe and free space, and that's what the club provided. And when we were putting together an exhibition more broadly about the activism of the village, we just kept coming across the same name.
Yeah.
And that was really where it began, that there were these interlocking names, these networks of influence that just really felt like they needed to be explored. And I just wanted to dig more deeply into that story.
And such a variety of them from many different backgrounds, from writers and artists to activists to labor union organizers. Do you have any favorites?
Oh, it's so many favorites. Well, I think one of the challenges of dealing with this enormous roster of members in the club was always trying to narrow it down, and I kept trying to pick people every time, when I was working on the book and just thinking it would be so much easier if I could just come up with a list of like 5 or 10, and then these are the people, and then everyone else is in the background. But it just didn't work that way, because you would come across, there would be some secondary names, I'd be like, I haven't really heard of this person, maybe they're not that important. And then you'd look them up and it would be like, well, this person was the first practicing psychoanalyst, female psychoanalyst in the country, or this person, and just this person published, 17 novels, and none of them are known now, but they were a pretty big deal in their day. And So even the people whose names were obscure to me, having researched the era and the club, they all proved to be really significant. There was nobody who was just, I don't know, just showed up and was kind of a hanger-on.
And so many of these women were active in multiple areas, right? They would have been, like Crystal Eastman is a peace activist, and she's a writer, and she writes about birth control, she writes about lynching, and then she's involved in the origins of the idea of workers' compensation, and so they come back like a comet. They keep coming back.
That's a great image, and absolutely, she's a really great example. Crystal Eastman is one of the co-founders of the ACLU, and she's been getting a bit more attention recently, but she was for a very long time overshadowed by her younger brother, Max Eastman, who was a very famous journalist, editor, and activist. Who was very left-wing and then went very right-wing, as often happens, especially with men. And the interesting part about that, again, as a structural challenge to writing a book about these women, is I couldn't classify them into groups. I couldn't just kind of put, okay, the activists over here and the artists over here and the subdivide kind of, these are the suffragists, these are the, because everybody did everything.
Exactly.
And what became really my guiding principle in the book, and I hope it comes through, was that I was really interested in friendship and the idea that it was the friendship among these very different women that brought them into different forms of activism. And it makes sense. If you think about it, it's, why do you go to a protest? You can believe in a cause, but if your friend says, hey, we're going to this march, and will you march with me? Will you be part of this? Will you come join my, I'm doing this play, this project, this other, there's so much, there's so much kind of casual, you can get the sense of this.
Will you hold the other side of my sign?
That's a great example. The founder of Heterodoxy, who we'll talk a bit more about in a bit, I think, but she was marching in a suffrage parade, and the very famous at the time novelist Fannie Hurst writes in her memoir about being drawn into the parade because Marie Jenny Howe holds out literally the other end of her banner and says, hold this up and march with me. And it's a kind of one of the other members of Heterodoxy calls it psychological suction that drew them into it, specifically in this case, the suffrage movement. But the idea that, that's how you go from being a spectator to a participant. And, that's how your sort of social life evolves, and very much that's how the village social world and activist world overlapped. There wasn't a separation.
All the cool kids were doing it.
Absolutely.
I really did love, though, your discussion of friendship as an area of biography, of understanding, and that's been overlooked in a lot of ways. Now we focus on partnerships, love relationships. We focus on someone's family background or their work or what they've left behind, but not so much on the slightly less tangible idea of friendship.
Yeah, and I think partly that's a bit of an archival problem. You get more records of love letters or romantic, people record the sort of intensity of their relationship. So a lot of the way of sort of doing charting the history of friendship is really just seeing kind of who's still around, who's, you don't necessarily get declarations of affection and that are sort of visible in the archive, but you can chart this and realize that, like, through divorces and separations and changes of address and whatever, people are still writing to each other, they're still showing up at the same events, and heterodoxy, certainly the longevity of those relationships is really visible in sort of letters and diaries, and in a way, the complexity of friendship just tends to not be written about as much, I think, and it was really fun to try to chart that and try to see where where the kind of the connections came from.
And it makes sense in essentially what's a group biography, right? This is a story of a group of friends who may not have always agreed. That was part of the point. That you could have all these different beliefs, different backgrounds, different passions, and they did not always agree. They had good reason sometimes not to, but the sense of those relationships nonetheless holding them through, carrying them through, and connecting them to these ideas. Just interesting to me.
And I think specifically what I was really interested in was thinking about feminist friendship, and the feminist friendship, I should put the emphasis there, but the idea of these women were feminists. The club was a feminist club. They were sort of at the forefront of figuring out what that word meant. It was a new word in English around this time. Initially, it's capitalized or italicized. It's this funny French word that comes in, and eventually it becomes a well-known word, and there's a flurry of articles, many of them written by the members of Heterodoxy, about what this is. What does the word mean? What's the difference between a feminist and a suffragist? What's the difference between, what do these women want that's sort of above and beyond the vote? So that was really something that these women were interested in figuring out.
Literally asking these questions. Like there was a set of meetings in 1914 called "What is Feminism?" Right? Or another of the individuals wrote a whole, is it a book or an article? I forget, called "What Women Want."
That's a whole book. Right. Yes, she was. Beatrice Forbes Robertson Hale, which is an extraordinary. It's a mouthful. There are a lot of multiple names. I ended up using a lot of first names because sentence just got too much.
So if they're working on developing what feminism means to them, what feminism might be.
I'm going to cut in one more time.
Oh, dear.
I'm so sorry. It is not an issue. I'm trying to make sure your video quality is as high as possible so we can see your wonderful faces.
Thank you.
You're doing a great job so far.
I'm interested in so at a heterodoxy meeting, what did it look like? Where would they meet and what did they talk about? Was it all each evening? Was it let's talk about what feminism means again, or were they approaching it in different ways? What might a meeting have if you were invited to one?
Yeah, so it's we know a few things from memoirs and various records, even though there weren't minutes kept, so we don't know the ins and outs week by week. But we know that the club met every other week on Saturday afternoons. At some point, they shifted to Tuesday evenings, but that's sort of later and somewhat outside the scope of this book. So the Saturday afternoon lunch, sort of then deep into the afternoon meetings. They had a certain structure. We know that there was generally a topic that was agreed in advance. Often there would be a designated speaker, either from within the club or somebody would be invited to come and present. We know that they had, even though the club was women only, they had semi-regular what they called husbands' evenings, which was sort of a joke. But the idea of so men would be invited every now and again to kind of listen in and join the discussion. But it was definitely a mix, it seems, of a kind of a specific idea, but the conversation would sort of flow somewhat freely. There were generally around at the most about 40 women in the room. So it could be very, very busy and very loud. The Marie Jenny Howe is famously within the club famous for wielding her gavel. She had a little gavel that she would use to tap on the tabletop to call the meetings to order, and she did her best to sort of keep things on track. But they would meet in village restaurants and in sometimes in the early days, probably we think at the Liberal Club, although the timing of the Liberal Club opening and the beginning of the club it's all very a little bit shrouded in myth. But these are all spaces that were essentially carved out of big townhouses that had sort of fallen into somewhat a shabby state of affordability, let's say. Many on McDougall Street in the heart of the village. So the Liberal Club was at 35, I think. There's some dispute.
You'll be forgiven.
But there was again, the density of the village is really important here. So there's a little block of 4 houses on McDougall Street, and within that space there was a basement restaurant, there was a bookstore, there was the Liberal Club that also had a theatre. There were, I think, spaces where people actually lived on some of the upper floors. People did rent rooms there, and there were all these various kind of informal meeting places, little shops, little kind of, so it was this kind of
cafes.
The tea shops and cafes, and that's certainly a little bit later when the village becomes a bit more commercialized and touristy. There's a sudden explosion of village, but there's a proliferation, I should say, of tea shops in basements, and they often had these very kind of twee themes. And but one of the things, just to finish up that talk about the village, one of the things that I think gets somewhat neglected in histories of the village is how important women were in that business side of the village. We're in a woman-owned bookstore, so it's appropriate to talk about, the importance, the lifeblood of small businesses, especially community-minded small businesses. In the village, these were all run by women. So many of these galleries, tea shops, restaurants, bars, shops selling fashion, shops selling kind of like, women who are artisans who are selling, the sort of batik kaftans and other kind of classic village looks. So many of them were women. Some involved with heterodoxy, some sort of on the fringes, but it was a real, the men who wrote sort of intellectual histories of the village tended to downplay that contribution, but a large part of the scene and the feeling of the culture of the area was women run.
And one thing in the exhibition that we really enjoyed creating was the sense of creating a space for visitors to walk into, and we recreated a coffee shop. And it was partially to sort of evoke this bohemian sense of the village, but also we were saying it was a new idea for women to be able to go out to a coffee shop on their own, to go to a restaurant, to dine by themselves, or to meet friends. And this was fairly new in that it was acceptable for women to do this. So this idea of now getting together and talking politics, or talking about Freud or Montessori schooling, or the strikes in Lawrence, Massachusetts, was growing out of this, that women were getting together to talk about big ideas.
Absolutely, and that's how these movements were growing. This is how they were getting the word out. One of the ways that heterodoxy sort of functioned clearly was as something of a networking opportunity. There were a lot of writers, often freelance, because women had very, very, very hard time getting staff jobs on newspapers and magazines at the time. So the vast majority of the professional journalists in Heterodoxy worked freelance, and so they were giving each other work. They were connecting their friends with their editors. They were doing what professional organizations, professional networking organizations do at the same time as they were, organizing social gatherings and salons and parties and marches and protests. So it was all sort of part of the same sort of fervor and the same energy. I think that the place is really important in the in sort of pushing these ideas forward.
The sense of constant cross-pollination too, that, like you said, that they're introducing each other to different editors or different jobs, but also that they're sharing ideas. And if you have a group of people from a wide range of backgrounds and interests, they're going to influence their others' thinking.
Absolutely, and we can talk about some individuals probably in that way, and sort of some specific places where that happened. And I think one of the challenges with writing history that focuses on specific activism or a specific fight, you miss that sense of cross-pollination. So a great example is Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, one of my faves. She's a really fascinating character. She was one of the youngest members of Heterodoxy. She was only in her early 20s when the group started to meet, but she had already become a very, very prominent national organizer with the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, who she had been working for as a leader, as a speaker, since she dropped out of high school at 17. And so she had already, she was traveling to protests and industrial actions all over the country. She was this diminutive Irish teenager, and she was already, she was notorious around the country already at that point. When she joined Heterodoxy, she was very skeptical about about a lot of the women in the club, because it was largely a middle class group, and she was a working class kid. She had she'd grown up in the Bronx, and
she was Irish.
She was Irish, and she was raised by unionists and activists, and she was very she really thought that solidarity and connection and community had to happen between within the working class. That was the vision of the IWW, was class solidarity, and she just didn't understand or didn't really believe that gender offered the same kind of community, and that women, she just didn't think that rich women had the same interests.
And it just wasn't going to be the way the world would change. You couldn't, women joining together and concentrating on what they thought of as a gendered interest just wasn't going to be the way to foster any kind of change, or especially the kind of revolution that she wanted.
Yeah, and I think that after about 10 years of working as one of the few women in a prominent position within the IWW, she realized that she needed other women, because although she was an extremely effective organizer, she was very much on her own. She was the girl, and she also had, there were also she had a baby very young, and she had to have, so her mother was coming with her on the road and taking care of the baby, and there were moments and places of a sort of solidarity with other women, other mothers that she found. And she wrote that heterodoxy was this unexpected delight. It was a real joy to her to discover this circle of friends, and she hadn't thought would be in her corner at all. And actually, a lot of them were really committed to fighting on behalf of industrial workers. It was a cause that brought in a very wide range of people, certainly before World War I.
Definitely. Were there other members of the group who, like Flynn, were in some ways outsiders, who either came around to this idea of feminism or who pushed against it in some ways? I'm thinking maybe Grace Neal Johnson or like,
Grace Neal Johnson is a really interesting figure. She was the wife of James Weldon Johnson, who was very, very famous, still, I think, a well-known name, but at the time, a very, very well-known African-American activist, writer, songwriter. I mean, talk about a polymath. I mean, he's extraordinary. Most famous probably now, as he and his brother co-wrote the Negro National Anthem, the Lift Every Voice and Sing. He was also the first Black person in his state to become qualified as a lawyer. He just has all kinds of firsts. Grace Neal Johnson, he married her when he's quite a bit older than her, but they married when she was very, very wealthy. She was born into a very wealthy African American family in Brooklyn. Her father owned a hotel, and her brother was a real estate developer in Harlem. One of the people who really kind of created Harlem as a destination for African Americans in the 1920s. And she was brought into heterodoxy. This is the place where I'll do my little. I did my historical digging for this one. I was always fascinated by her because she was named in every history that mentions heterodoxy. Generally, there's a mention of the one African American member, but there's no sense of sort of how or why she was brought into the club. So I was really fascinated by that and sort of thinking, like, is there some? Did she just? Yeah. How did she turn up? Because the village and a lot of the village restaurants and village meeting places were not open.
No, it was very segregated.
It was
Bohemian, but segregated.
Yeah, Bohemia had a very big race blind spot, and she was. But as it turns out, she was brought into the club very explicitly by Marie Howe, who was the founder and a friend through her husband and also through her own activism, very connected with the NAACP. And it was around the time just before James Weldon Johnson became the head of the NAACP, which he did in 1920. But I found these wonderful letters from Marie to Grace, and she addresses her that way. They're very affectionate, and they write, and the first letter I found was a formal invitation to join Heterodoxy. That came in 1918, so the club had already been around for about 6 years at that point. And so there's an explicit outreach. She's brought in, she's asked to talk about, not initially, later on she's asked to talk about lynching, when she becomes part of a group of women who are who call themselves the anti-lynching crusaders, and so she's invited to talk about that work. But there's also, there's certainly a sense that she is a representative of her race in the group. And there's for instance, I found letters from other members who are sort of saying, I saw this. I think one of them talks about going to see Shuffle Along on Broadway and sort of like, what did you think? And it's that kind of it's a friendship, but it's certainly a different. The friendship has a different quality that I think is complicated to pass at this kind of distance, given the context of how very, very segregated American society was at the time. But she's a really fascinating figure. She's one of many who I think deserves her own biography. So
many of them do. Exactly.
Yeah, there's just such a rich, awesome. But she's a really
so much research. And for a club that didn't keep records, right? That's not an easy kind of research to do.
No, and it's a lot of this kind of piecing together, like the friendships and things, and looking at letters that were written. I mean, there's certainly there are recollections that are pretty detailed, and the major piece of evidence about the club is a wonderful album that's entirely digitized, that's in the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, Harvard, and you can look through it. And this was given to Marie, the founder, in 1920, and then updated later. I think that it was given. I think it was she turned 50 in 1920, so I think that's why. Although I'm not entirely sure. It's not.
Put it together for
It was
her.
a gift.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing document of photographs and notes, talking to sort of praising her for her work with Heterodoxy, but also just attesting to the importance of the club in these women's lives. And it's huge, and it's this incredible. I think it's in itself just an incredible document of women's friendship, and the women write brief notes, but even the brief ones are just so affectionate, and it really shows how important love was in their lives.
I'm just struck by it's such a different kind of research than what we did for an exhibition, right? So I'm just entranced by the detail you're able to put in here, because when you do an exhibition, you can't do that kind of detail.
Well, they was. I mean, what was so. I mean, so many of these women were writers, and I confess I did not read every novel published by every woman in this book, because my goodness, there was just a lot of writing that was.
Urban economics itself would be too big.
Oh gosh, yes. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who is probably the best known of Heterodoxy, was enormously prolific. This was a time when writing fiction was way more lucrative than writing nonfiction. So some of the most successful writers were just pumping out these like sentimental stories, and they would get paid. You could pay your rent on one short story. The scream, the weeping. And so one of my other one of the faves, Mary Heaton Vorse. Married by Denham. There's so many Marys.
There's a lot of Marys.
Mary Heaton Vorse, who was an incredible labor reporter. In her early career, she supported her feckless husband and 3 children on her writing as a freelance kind of writer of sentimental fiction. And it's an extraordinary, the economics of writing are really fascinating, whole other story. But but yes, you had these women were writing stories that were about kind of family, and then they were writing what we think of as sort of hard journalism, reporting, and it was fascinating to look at how their the writing that even they didn't take very seriously in her cases, the kind of the short stories, how those really tried to push it gender assumptions and stereotypes, and try to you get these glimpses of kind of how much can you push the kind of romantic happy ending plot to allow for the unhappy ending. I mean, one of my favorite statistics about heterodoxy is that around 1/3 of the women in the group, which numbered roughly 100 over the course of its existence, about 1/3 of those women were divorced at least once. About 2% of American women were divorced at the time, and it was an expensive and very, very exposing process, a very difficult process. That's a really extraordinary.
Absolutely, were divorcing people right and left,
and so they needed, so they, and that's one of the things I think about sort of this kind of friendship, that you need you need to know it's possible. And if suddenly you're surrounded by women who are divorced or who are living in open same-sex committed partnerships, which several of the other women were, the idea of what's possible just kind of is really what expands and explodes
absolutely
through this club.
And it's not for nothing that another area that they were very interested in was how women could support themselves, right? And how could women live independently and not be supported, not be dependent, at least dependent on a man for their rent and their food and for everything else. And so that's a theme that runs through all these, their stories, their arguments, their plays.
Absolutely. And depending on their sort of class position and personal circumstances, they felt that very acutely. And a lot of the the challenge of sort of cross-class organizing is often about the fact that women who worked in factories were not paid, were paid a fraction of what men were paid, so they just couldn't be independent. Marriage was expected as the thing that you did as a matter of survival as much as a romantic religious commitment, or those things were not negligible in sort of in a lot of those communities, but they were also just a practical impossibility to just make your own way. And again, having friends around you who did it really showed you
there's that difficulty even and even before there's children in the picture. That's yet another one of these themes that they keep talking about is the early birth control movement and how central that was in all their arguments. How could you live a life in which you did not have children, or could limit the number of children you had, or how was this done?
Most of the women in the club who had children had a very small number for the time. I think only one or two who had more than 2, 3, and they were generally very wealthy, and often had them sort of either had them pretty young and then went on to do other things, or had them late, having already made money, or so there were definitely a significant number of the group were mothers, but not again on anything like a statistical equivalency with American women as a whole at the time. So they were really living what feels like a much more modern kind of approach to women's lives, where they were making choices about marriage and children that were not simply about inevitability or necessity, or and so there were real there was a real sense that all of these things were connected. That the economic position of women, access to birth control, all of these things that we in individual lives are connected, but they were really making those connections in conversation with each other and through the example of each other's lives.
They were very interested in modernity and how all of these, what a modern marriage might be like, what a modern woman's life would be like, what could she do that would allow her to be independent or to limit the number of children she might have, that these are all part of their thinking. And you feel like if you were to be zapped back to a heterodoxy meeting in the past, that I imagine at least that the women in that room might seem much more relatable or recognizable to us today than the average woman on the street then. That they were, that's my fantasy. I love time travel. So that's my idea. Even though the way they might have been dressed was, was in our eyes and in their eyes, that was modern. They were really pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be a woman, how to function in society and how to change the society around them.
And they were very interested as well in the kind of internalized barriers. And this becomes much more of a kind of dominant sort of trend in feminism later on, after World War One, into the 20s, it gets a little away from that activist origin. But there's this real sense of the challenge of breaking free from your own expectations, your own upbringing. And when psychoanalysis kind of seizes the avant-garde imagination, women really found, a lot of feminists really found that thrilling, the idea that you could sort of look back into your own past and find the sort of secret and find the key to your future. And they didn't really necessarily, they weren't reading Freud, or they were sort of doing, they were making Freud work for them. He wasn't really interested in the liberation of women particularly, but but they really sort of saw this idea. And at heterodoxy meetings, we know they had meetings where they gave talks about their own upbringing, their own childhood, and they went back and they called them background talks, and they were a way of analyzing their own sort of group therapy as of a kind, a sort of or a group analysis where they were trying to figure out
consciousness raising.
And trying to figure out their own, how is it that you were in this room as a divorced feminist as opposed to down the street in a townhouse with position, right, 5 children and servants, and that's your job. So it's a very,
or that you are the servant down the street.
Right, exactly. And so how do you get to where you are from the place you came?
May I cut in for some questions?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yes, we would be delighted.
Yes. So we have an audience question from Emily McCann, and then I have a question personally that I'm just curious about, which you were actually just about to touch on, I think, maybe vaguely. But Emily asks, what parallels do you see between the time of Hotbed and now?
More than we would like, I think, seeing parallels. I think that certainly the idea that there are very strong connections between women's economic position, women's family lives, that these things are not separate. I think there were, for a long time, to massively generalize about upper class second wave feminism, there was an idea that if we could only advance in the workplace, we'd only keep breaking down professional barriers, we would
lean in feminism.
The great death knell of lean in feminism. But the idea was that if you just kept pushing for equality, professional equality, you could get there. You could get somehow to power. And what a lot of these women recognized was that didn't account for the many, 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 many other people who couldn't make those advances. That you were, the idea that, if you could just tread on enough people, you could get up to the top. That, I think that idea maybe is finally kind of realizing it's all connected, and you actually can't just, you can't just kind of lean in to the top without leaving people behind, and that's important. That you can't, that feminism that leaves people behind who aren't similarly privileged is just not worth fighting for. And I think that there's definitely a sense that feminism included a lot of these. Feminism was a holistic idea at this point. When they were still working it out, it was like, this is not just about my rights. It's about reorganizing society. And a lot of these women were socialists in some way or another, and they genuinely were like, we have to reorganize society. Capitalism and feminism are not compatible. So they wouldn't talk about it in quite these terms, but I do think modern feminism is kind of maybe getting that again.
You're veering into my next question.
Okay.
I wanted to talk a little bit about it. It seems like you have mentioned and highlighted a lot of really talented women who had maybe certain academic resources, or I guess it seems like there might have been a potential for a a class barrier when it comes to that movement. And yeah, like lean-in feminism was a big thing. People now, I think, are just waking up from the girl boss dream.
If you can just be a girl boss, we'll fix everything.
Yes.
And they're starting to understand that liberation is, not capitalistic. But yeah, I wanted to know a lot of, like, I guess in your research, what did you come across that struck you about, like, the class differences and how that manifested in this movement?
Yeah, it's really, it's very true that education, most of these women were well educated. Not all of them were going to the elite women's colleges, although a significant number did. And a significant number of them also were getting further education beyond college. So they weren't just, they were going to Vassar and everything else, but then they were
degrees.
Yeah, but they were getting master's degrees, they were getting PhDs, they were going to law school. So they were certainly, a lot of them, trying to drive beyond the kind of, college for their generation had become there was a kind of finishing school element to it for a certain kind of class of women. But they were sort of trying to, a lot of them trying to push further. But certainly, I mean, I think it's certainly true that they saw education and professional careers in law, in social work, especially in teaching, in medicine. These were not just kind of ways of making money and getting professional kind of as a certain status, but also as a way of doing work that they considered important. So I think that's certainly a part of the story. But at the same time, they had women in the room like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, like Rose Parker Stokes, who was a very equally famous socialist whose story was, everybody loved her story. She was she had grown up, she was an immigrant, she was a Jewish immigrant, she had worked in a cigar factory, she was working class, and she met and married one of the richest, the younger son of one of the richest industrial families in the country, and it was this kind of whole Cinderella,
Socialist
Cinderella. That, I mean, she it didn't end great. He didn't. I mean, it was good for a while. they diverged. He got much more radical, and mainstream socialism got more conservative, I guess.
A lot of them were interested in social reforms. A lot of these women were involved with settlement houses, for example. So these were women who had gone to college, who were, white Protestant, middle class, upper class women who were interested in how they could use those privileges to help immigrants, to help working class women unionize, for example, or to things like that. So there was definitely an awareness. But there was also some serious limitations. You could only go so far when it wasn't you who was on strike, right? It wasn't you who didn't know how you would pay your rent. So,
and it was also they were aware of that privilege and power, and they were able to get press attention for strikes, and they were able to get, that they could bring these issues kind of to a higher sort of powerful level, but they still were kind of having to make compromises with power. So it was certainly not. They tried different approaches, but I think there are a lot that look like things that still feel like valuable approaches, and there are also things that look very uncomfortable, that get into a kind of much more paternalistic or sort of assimilationist sort of idea. I mean, they were thoughtful about it, but the distinctions that they were drawing, they're like, we're not doing charity, we're doing something that's over here from charity. It's like, it's not quite as far away as you think it is. Yeah. So that it certainly, it was. I think one way in which it feels very contemporary is they were you could not be aware of the inequality in the country, and you could not be aware, living in New York, of the poverty and the grinding daily struggle of immigrant families, of laboring families. And it was right there. If you were living in Greenwich Village, it was right there on the Lower East Side, or it was right. And this was so, and I think that was really the sense that they felt like they had to do something, that it was immoral, it was obscene not to pay attention to these issues.
But the Triangle Fire was literally at the other side of the park.
Yeah.
They were meeting just south of Washington Square Park, and just to the east was the location of where this horrific fire had been. And so it was all very close together, and they were very aware.
And women in the club were looking for, were doing factory inspection work, doing, doing work with organizations that were trying to enforce standards, trying to do, trying to figure out how to make this stop. But their approach, and people were sort of trying everything. And so
the Patterson pageant, for example, there was this huge strike in Patterson, New Jersey, where they were silk factories, silk, like ribbons, for example, and there was all kinds of child labor and all. And Mabel Dodge and others, they make this enormous pageant in Madison Square Garden, where they recreate the strike with the actual strikers, and they
like
sell
1,000 people come from Madison.
I love that you pointed out that's where the origin of Sell Out the Garden came from. Right, they sold out the garden, and yet the strike didn't go too far anyway. So
most people did not get pay raises, and they went back to work, or they did, and then the pay was cut again. So it was these attempts. They wanted to do big things, and yet change was incremental. And maybe that's always what happens.
Feels like it.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, do you want to say anything? A little send-off message, either you plug your book, maybe.
Read the book.
Hotbed is a great. It's a great story. I mean, I hope I told it well, but these women are fantastic. You will learn. It was an undiscovered. To me, it was a lot of new stories that I didn't know, and new characters, and people who haven't been central in our histories of leftist politics, of activism, of avant-garde theater. There's a lot of there's something for everyone.
And if you can't get enough of Joanna, she does have another book.
I do.
Yes. Would you like to just talk about that really quick?
Sure. Yes. My first book, The Extra Woman, is also available. That was is a slightly later historical period, 1930s, and it was the book is a biography of Marjorie Hillis, who was a fabulous self-help writer for single women in the 1930s. So it's about her and her story and her moment.
One thing that you do in both, as a way to plug the book, is that you approach these people. They become real people. They're very real. They're approachable. They're human, and their relationships are very human. And you create. It is a wonderful story, and you make real relationships among them, between them.
Well, that is what I tried to do.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Wave bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for
listening.
tuning in.
Thank you so much.